Okay, hi. Thank you. I had this whole speech planned, and I was going to introduce you, or myself to you as Paul the Best Man, but there's something that I feel that I should add, because today Chris and I almost ended up in a civil partnership, and you might find that extraordinary, but what actually happened was that we were in Prague, and this was for brunch, and we had a photographer with us, and I happened to lay down on this kind of sunbed out in the garden, and there were these ladies who were in their 50s who kind of caught sight of my socks. Now, I will show you my socks, but only by private request. But actually, they thought that we were together for some reason, and they bought us champagne. And as this lie became more elaborate, it seemed really quite cruel to disturb their reality. And besides that, and bearing in mind my daughter's in the room, who's 3.5, the champagne was fucking lovely. But anyway, I'm going to limit my role to the role of best man, and as best man, it really is incumbent on me to say a few words about and on behalf of the bride and groom. Now, when Chris asked me to stand up for him, I have to say that I felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Pride because I value Chris's friendship very deeply, and anxiety because equally I value his friendship very deeply. I fretted that I would stand in front of you and fluff my lines. So I consulted a number of friends who had been best men in the past, and they gave me some common and, dare I say, cliched advice. And the advice was that I should imagine you, my audience, to be naked. But I want you to rest assured that the majority of you are in fact fully clothed. None more so than Chris himself and Miriam, of course. But Miriam, let me begin by saying that you look stunning. I'm so pleased that you've married Chris. I had begun to wonder whether Chris would ever take a bride. And it has taken him some considerable time. Privately, I began to speculate on what the reason might be. There were a few clues, but there was an element of misdirection also. Chris has collected a number of attractive girlfriends over the years, but to my knowledge, they've never been friends with benefits. To my knowledge. Which of course is, for someone who is on occasion predisposed to vanity, unusual. I'll concede that viewed together and in the absence of any other evidence, I permitted the thought that Chris might be more Streisand than Springsteen. But as I reflect, Chris wasn't withholding a secret. In fact, he's honest in a way that few others are. What Chris reveals, he reveals without premeditation. I can think of one example where Chris inadvertently told me exactly who he was. Early into our friendship, I invited Chris to stay with Claire and myself at our home on the South Coast. Privately and probably drunkenly, I confessed to Chris that when I was a child, I had a crush on Kim Cattrall. From Sex and the City, yeah? Okay? Anyway, I didn't think anything more about my confession, but a few days later, Chris suggested that we should watch Mannequin. Now, I'm not proud to admit this, but I actually had a copy of the film, and it was hidden under my side of the bed, you know? Very solicitous, I know, I understand that. Anyway, I returned to the front room, which has been ready with drinks and nibbles. Diet Coke for Chris, of course. Anyhow, we were an hour into the film when Chris benignly asked me if I'd ever noticed how big Kim Cattrall's head was. I looked at the screen, and the more I looked, the more disproportionately large her head appears. Kim was no longer my sexy subject. She wasn't Kim Cattrall anymore. She was more like Kim Jong-il. In that moment, Chris destroyed any chance that Miss Cattrall might have had of having a relationship with me. Obviously. But he also divulged how exacting his standards were in a partner. She would have to be proportionate. And I have to say, Miriam, you're proportionate. In addition to Chris's very particular requirements, there was potentially another barrier to Chris finding love. His personality. So those of you who don't know Chris as I do, let me explain. I asked Chris to tell me about Miriam, about how they met, and how he knew she was the one. He replied, and I'm going to quote this, Christopher, "Oh man, you're going to make me talk about that stuff." He continued, "Met her through Match, and just realised this girl was different." He closed by saying that they had good chemistry, and that Miriam's personality complemented his. Not exactly Shakespearean, Mr. Stagg. I wondered if Miriam would fare any better. So I emailed her and I asked if she could share what drew her to Chris. She replied, "I'm blinded by love. He can do no wrong." Now I was reassured by this, because clearly it was love and not chloroform that brought them together. In addition, it struck me that Miriam was equally averse to wordiness, and in that way they were obviously well suited. Now I remember hoping at the time that Chris and Miriam would resist writing their own vows, although by this point you're probably wishing they'd written my speech, because it would have finished a couple of minutes ago. Anyhow, later on Miriam did share a funny story with me. It turns out that Chris is something of a domestic goddess. For one of their dates, Chris prepared a signature dish of rosemary chicken, which I'm assured was very good indeed. I can only assume that Chris was buoyed by confidence because he made cupcakes shortly afterwards. Time passed, and Miriam moved in with Chris. Shortly after that point, Miriam decided to give their home a good cleaning. Looking for a place to stow a few pots, she opened a drawer to discover the cooking equipment that Chris had used to impress her, hidden and unwashed. Miriam went on to confide, "Needless to say, I was a little scared to open the other cabinets and drawers." Miriam, fucking right. But I'm here to help Miriam. I have learned a lot about your husband over the years, and more recently, I've been fed information from a number of people gathered here today. So begins my précis of Christopher Stagg. Christopher Stagg is also known as Christopher Robin to some of you. As a child, Chris struggled to say his sister's name, Alison. He could only manage to say "ass in." From my experience, ass remains one of his favourite words. His bond with Alison is enduring as it is endearing. She is very much his Alison, a point that he makes with some force when reminded that he has an attractive sibling. His protectiveness suggests not only that he is a family man, but it's probably best that he fathers boys. At high school, Chris befriended Megan and Bonnie, and I believe they're here tonight. Megan told me that one of the first things she learned about him was his love for warboats. Now, I'm not sure that I would have led with that, Chris, but it turns out that he may have been onto something, because later he let two girls dressed up as Brittany and Christina wrap him up in toilet roll. Now, I've never spoken about warboats in my life to a girl, but similarly, I've never had a Brittany and Christina experience. Megan also claims to be partly responsible for the well-groomed man that we see before us today. Apparently, Chris turned up to his sweet 16 with less, and this is a quote, less than acceptable hair. So she introduced him to the world of hair products. Untamed hair notwithstanding, Chris was described to me as smoking hot. Now, if none of you want to admit to that, that's fine, but honestly, he was. That Chris is a good-looking man is, in my opinion, unarguable. To me, he has the looks of a Hollywood A-lister, the hair of a lifeguard, and the expression of a politician. No, let me finish. It's as though a geneticist spliced the genes of Ryan Gosling, David Hasselhoff, and George W. Bush. Despite his good looks, Chris is self-conscious. At college, I'm told he would only wear hoodies and pants. When challenged on his rationale, he explained that jeans make his butt look fat. Now, I have to say, many of you here today have messaged me with very similar anecdotes. As friends, we are affiliates in the belief that Chris is a great guy. I hugely admire him, and I love sharing time with him. I really do, Chris. We are both drawn to the inappropriate, often involuntarily, which leads me to one last story about Chris. Whilst visiting a friend in DC, Chris entered into a battle of wits with an 8-year-old. Clearly frustrated by the child, he called the boy an arsehole. I have to say that until I heard this story, I assumed that arsehole was my epithet, as he tends to call me that a lot. It turns out I'm not that special after all. But that's probably enough about Chris. However, there are a few general remarks that I'd like to make. When Chris asked me to be best man, I inquired what he might expect. And he told me that he'd like wisdom and reassurance. He obviously came to the wrong person. But this is my attempt. Chris, the common argument against getting married is that you wake up with the same person day after day. From experience, I can tell you that's not the case. You really needn't worry. You may think that you are married to Snow White, but you have actually ended up with the 7 dwarfs. You start off with Happy and Bashful, then you meet Sleepy and Sneezy, who give way to Grumpy and Dopey, before yielding, and I mean yielding, to Dopey, to Dop. I was thinking my mother. Anyway, seriously though, Chris, I believe that you have found the person that you're meant to be with. I'd like to think that if you hadn't met on Match, that you would have met somewhere else. In Miriam, you have married a woman who is not only beautiful, but possessed of rare qualities. When Chris and Miriam visited me earlier this year, I was very seriously unwell. And I have to say that Miriam showed me only empathy and concern. It was impossible not to talk to her immediately, and I know that my wife and daughter felt the same way too. Chris and Miriam, I hope that today has been all that you hoped it would be. Miriam, my wife Claire, told me that when she dreamt about her wedding day as a little girl, the dream stayed with her as she grew up. As men, we generally don't talk about finding a soulmate. But we do dream about finding that special partner. I know that my dreams were surpassed on my wedding day. And I know, looking at Miriam and knowing the qualities that she has as a person, Chris must feel the same way today. With that, I would ask you to please all be upstanding and join me in a toast, simply to Mr. and Mrs. Fagg. Come on, get off your asses, stand up. Cheers.